In a quiet household, hidden behind the mask of innocence, lived a boy whose silence carried heavier secrets than anyone could imagine. To his parents, he was just their youngest child, obedient, fragile, and unnoticed. But deep within he carried scars no one cared to see. What they never realized was that their neglect had awakened something far more dangerous than anger. It had birthed a mastermind. And as the days passed, the son carefully stitched together a secret plan of revenge that would change the family forever. The night was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that felt almost deliberate, as though the walls themselves were listening. Kairos sat at the corner of his small room, the dim glow of a cracked lamp flickering above his head. He had grown accustomed to nights like these, nights when his parents' voices echoed down the hallway, sometimes filled with bitterness, sometimes with cold indifference, but never with warmth. He told himself long ago that he was used to it, that their absence of love no longer mattered. Yet there was something heavy tonight, something gnawing at him in ways he couldn't quite name. Curiosity was something his parents always discouraged, but for Kairos, it was the only tool that kept his mind alive. While searching for one of his father's books in the study, he found a drawer that had always been locked. He had noticed it before but never thought much of it until now. The lock was old, rust eating at the edges, and with a little patience and a paperclip it clicked open in his hands. At first he expected to find nothing more than documents or old bills, the boring remnants of adult life. But what he saw made his stomach tighten. Inside were photographs, not the kind that celebrated family or happy occasions, but snapshots of a different life. His parents were younger, but their faces carried the same hard lines he knew so well. In one, his father stood with a woman he did not recognize, holding her hand in a way that was unmistakably intimate. In another, his mother appeared with a man whose face was blurred from movement, her expression tender, unguarded, nothing like the sharpness she showed at home. Kairos's chest constricted as he sifted through more, finding letters tied with a string, words written in hurried passion. They spoke of lies, of secrecy, of promises whispered in the dark. His parents had been betraying not just each other, but the very idea of the family they forced him to believe in. For a long moment, he simply sat frozen. The photographs scattered across the desk like shattered pieces of a puzzle he had never wanted to solve. The betrayal wasn't directed at him, but he felt the sting of it all the same. The people who demanded loyalty, who commanded obedience, who punished him for every small mistake, had lived lives riddled with deception. The realization twisted something inside him. He wasn't just their son, he was their victim. Their lies had shaped his silence, their cruelty had molded his loneliness, and now their hypocrisy burned like fire in his veins. He gathered the photographs quickly when he heard footsteps in the hall, tucking them back into the drawer with precision. But the images refused to leave his mind. He kept replaying the smiles, the touches, the words in those letters. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling as anger pulsed through him in quiet waves. His parents weren't the strong figures he once feared. They were fragile, flawed, and selfish. They had weaknesses he now understood. As days turned into weeks, Kairos began noticing details he had ignored before. The way his father stayed out later than usual, the odd silences at dinner, the occasional phone calls that made his mother leave the room. Their betrayals were not buried in the past. They were alive, woven into their daily lives. And every time he saw those cracks, the plan began to right itself in his mind. Revenge wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a growing force, a shadow whispering that he was no longer powerless. He had knowledge they didn't know he possessed, and knowledge was the sharpest weapon he could ever wield. Kairos didn't confront them. He didn't scream or cry. That would have been too easy, too expected. Instead, he returned to his silence, but now it was purposeful. His parents continued to dismiss him, believing his quiet nature meant he was harmless, invisible. They never suspected that behind his calm eyes, he was dissecting their lives, analyzing every word, every movement. What had once been the passive survival of a neglected child was now the strategic patience of a boy with a mission. Sometimes, late at night, he would return to the drawer, carefully reopening it just to remind himself that what he saw was real. The photographs became more than evidence. They became fuel. He studied the letters, memorized the words, as though they were lessons teaching him about the fragility of trust and the ugliness of hidden desires. With every detail, his understanding grew sharper, his resolve stronger. Kairos began keeping a small notebook under his mattress, where he scribbled observations and thoughts, not in the form of confessions but as calculations. He noted times, habits, inconsistencies, slowly building a map of his parents' double lives. The boy they had ignored, belittled, and underestimated was now steps ahead of them. They thought they were in control, but the balance had shifted the moment he opened that drawer. The betrayal he uncovered wasn't just about affairs or secrets. It was about the truth of who his parents really were. They demanded respect without earning it, enforced rules they themselves had broken, and crafted an image of a family that had never truly existed. For Kairos, the discovery was more than shocking. It was liberating. He no longer needed to feel small in their presence. He had something they feared: exposure. And so, in the stillness of his room, beneath the silence that cloaked his every move, a new version of Kairos began to form. One who would not simply endure, one who would calculate, wait, and strike when the moment was right. The boy his parents believed to be fragile was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. A son who had uncovered their greatest weakness and who was ready to use it against them in ways they could never see coming. The house was alive with sound, but none of it was directed toward him. The clinking of silverware, the muffled arguments, the hurried steps across the floor, all of it passed by Kairos as if he were a ghost living among the living. He sat at the dinner table, shoulders straight, eyes lowered, a model of silence. To anyone else, it might have seemed like obedience. To his parents, it was nothing unusual. They had long since grown accustomed to their son's quiet demeanor, mistaking it for fragility, for weakness. But beneath the stillness of his face was an ocean of thought, waves crashing and pulling back, carefully hiding their sound. He had learned early on that speaking was dangerous. Every time he opened his mouth as a child, he was met with sharp corrections or dismissive laughter. Over time, words lost their purpose and silence became his shield. Yet now, after uncovering the truth of his parents' betrayal, silence was no longer just a defense. It had become his weapon. The less he spoke, the more invisible he became. And the more invisible he became, the more he could see without being seen. His parents, blinded by their own lives and consumed with their secrets, never noticed the quiet intensity with which Kairos observed them. At the table, his father's voice was sharp, criticizing his mother's cooking, while his mother rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Kairos's fork hovered above his plate as he watched them, recording the smallest details in his mind. The way his father's hand twitched whenever his phone buzzed, the way his mother avoided eye contact when she answered simple questions. They were patterns, and Kairos understood that patterns revealed truth. He didn't need to confront them to know more. He just needed to watch. He studied them the way others might study a puzzle. Every word they said, every sigh, every absence carried meaning. When his father claimed to be working late, Kairos noted the slight smirk that crossed his mother's face. When his mother stayed locked in the bathroom for too long, speaking softly into her phone, Kairos listened to the rhythm of her voice, even if he couldn't hear the words. He didn't need the details to know what they meant. The truth was already exposed to him, and all he had to do was gather more threads until the web was complete. Outside the home, Kairos carried the same mask. At school, teachers called him shy. Classmates overlooked him, and no one bothered to dig deeper. He liked it that way. While others wasted energy on fitting in, Kairos spent his time honing his ability to read people. He noticed the way a teacher's smile faltered when lying about why homework was delayed. He saw how a friend's laugh became louder when covering up insecurity. To everyone else, these things were invisible. To Kairos, they were glaring. He realized people were always leaking truth. They just didn't realize anyone was watching closely enough to see. Every night, he would return to his room and jot down what he had learned. His small notebook, filled with observations that seemed mundane to anyone else but to him, carried significance. The exact time his father returned home. The way his mother's perfume lingered when she said she had only gone grocery shopping. The silence that followed certain phone calls. None of it was random. Each note was a piece of a grand design he was building in his mind. His parents thought they controlled the household, but in reality, Kairos was the one holding the blueprint of their lives. The mask of silence served him well. When his father barked at him for not speaking up, he simply lowered his eyes and let the storm pass. When his mother scolded him for being too quiet, he offered a faint nod. Their anger no longer hurt him. In fact, it gave him more time to observe. The more they dismissed him, the less they saw him as a threat. And that invisibility was his advantage. He began experimenting with his silence, testing its power. One evening, when his father misplaced an important document, Kairos knew exactly where it was. He had seen it lying under the sofa cushion the day before, but he said nothing. watching instead as his father tore the living room apart in frustration. His mother accused him of carelessness, and his father accused her of moving it. The argument escalated, voices rising, doors slamming, while Kairos sat quietly in his chair, calm and unreadable. That was when he realized just how powerful silence could be. It allowed chaos to bloom without him ever lifting a finger. In another moment, his mother asked him directly if he had noticed her phone missing. He had seen her leave it in the laundry basket earlier, but again, he simply shook his head. She grew frantic, suspecting his father, while his father mocked her paranoia. Again, they spiraled into accusations, and Kairos remained still, the puppet master hidden in plain sight. The more he practiced this art of silence, the more he understood that words were unnecessary. Silence was louder than anything he could ever say. It protected him, disguised him, and gave him control without them ever realizing it. His parents were too blinded by their own faults to suspect that their son, the boy they dismissed as quiet and harmless, was watching, calculating, and quietly shaping the battlefield of their home. Kairos no longer felt powerless. The betrayal he had discovered became the foundation of a new identity, an identity cloaked in silence, sharpened by observation. His parents were unraveling, and all he had to do was sit still, watching the pieces fall exactly where he wanted them to. The day it happened began like any other, cloaked in the dull repetition Kairos had come to expect from school. He sat in the back of the classroom, his notebook open but nearly empty, the pages filled more with silent thoughts than with lessons. His teachers rarely noticed him, his classmates hardly spoke to him, and Kairos had long ago accepted this invisibility as both a curse and a gift. But what unfolded that afternoon would prove to be a spark, a force that shifted the quiet storm within him into something darker, something irreversible. It was during recess when Kairos lingered at the far end of the schoolyard, watching groups of children gather in their predictable circles. Laughter erupted from one corner, while petty arguments broke out in another. Kairos, as always, remained at the fringe, neither invited nor included. He wasn't surprised. He preferred it that way. But then came the voice, sharp and cutting, from a boy older and louder than the rest. "Hey, Kairos! Still hiding like a scared little mouse?" The taunt wasn't new. Bullies had circled him before, mocking his silence, his withdrawn nature, his refusal to defend himself. Normally, Kairos would lower his gaze, let the words wash over him, and retreat into the safety of his mind. But today, something inside him resisted. Perhaps it was the weight of the photographs still burned into his memory, or the sting of knowing his parents' hypocrisy. Perhaps it was simply that he had grown tired of being underestimated by everyone, at home and here alike. Whatever it was, it took root and refused to let go. The older boy approached, shoving Kairos in the chest, a cruel grin spreading across his face as the others gathered to watch. "What, nothing to say? Always so quiet. Bet your parents don't even notice you exist." The words cut sharper than intended, because they were true, and Kairos felt the sting twist into something else. Resolve. He didn't fight back. He didn't cry. He didn't even speak. Instead, he studied the boy, the way he laughed with his friends, the way his cruelty needed an audience to survive. Kairos memorized every detail, the rhythm of his laughter, the eagerness of his friends to join in, the exact way his eyes flickered with insecurity when he thought no one was watching. He stored it all, letting the humiliation fuel the careful fire already smoldering inside. The incident didn't end in blows. Teachers intervened before it escalated, scolding the older boy with words that carried no weight. The crowd dispersed, some amused, others indifferent, and Kairos walked back into the classroom without a word. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't just about his parents anymore. This moment showed him that the world beyond his home worked by the same rules. Those with power manipulated, lied, and hurt others, while those without it suffered in silence. Except Kairos was no longer content with silence. He wasn't powerless. He was learning, watching, storing every weakness of those who thought themselves untouchable. That evening, when he returned home, the echoes of the taunt followed him. His parents were in the living room, locked in yet another argument over nothing and everything. His father accused his mother of dishonesty, His mother hurled back with venom of her own, and Kairos stood at the edge of the room, silent as always. To them he was invisible, but to him they were transparent. Their weaknesses, their lies, their selfishness, it was all laid bare. He realized with chilling clarity that the bully at school and his parents were no different. Both thrived on dominance, on the illusion of control. Both believed he was too weak to matter, and both would eventually learn how wrong they were. In his room that night, Kairos opened his notebook, the one he kept hidden beneath his mattress. He flipped to a clean page and began to write. Not just observations this time, but intentions. The bully's name went first, followed by a list of traits: arrogant, attention-seeking, insecure without his friends. Then came his parents. Father, controlling but careless with details. Mother, manipulative but emotionally erratic. Side by side, the patterns became clear. People revealed themselves in their habits, in their flaws, and Kairos knew he had the patience to wait until those flaws destroyed them, or until he gave them the push they needed. The incident at school became a turning point, a crystallization of everything he had been feeling. For years he thought survival meant enduring, but now he understood that survival was just the beginning. Power didn't belong to those who shouted the loudest or struck the hardest. It belonged to those who watched in silence, who collected truths like weapons, who knew when to strike. He wasn't just a quiet boy anymore. He was a strategist in the making, a shadow no one noticed until it was too late. In the days that followed, Kairos began testing his ideas. He spread a rumor quietly about the boy who had mocked him. He whispered it to someone who thrived on gossip, planting just enough detail to make it believable. Within days, the story spread, and Kairos watched as the bully's laughter faltered, his friends casting doubtful glances, the same audience that once cheered his cruelty now questioning his strength. Kairos said nothing, never admitting his role, and no one suspected him. That was when he felt it, the thrill of control, the satisfaction of watching someone else unravel from the shadows. The secret incident at school, small and seemingly insignificant, to others, became the fuel that hardened Kairos's resolve. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was acting. Every betrayal by his parents, every insult from his peers, every moment of invisibility, they weren't punishments. They were lessons, teaching him how to become what they feared most. A mastermind, hiding in plain sight, patient, precise, and unstoppable. The first time it happened, it was almost too subtle to notice. His father came home late one evening, tossing his briefcase onto the sofa with his usual scowl. As he went to pour himself a drink, he found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the glass on the counter. He frowned, opening it only to see 4 simple words written in neat block letters. "You are being watched." His father scoffed at it, muttering about pranksters or maybe a mistake, but Kairos, sitting silently in the corner with his homework spread out before him, never looked up. He kept his expression perfectly still, as though he hadn't heard. Inside, however, his pulse quickened. The note was his creation, planted carefully when no one was watching. It was the first seed, the beginning of a game only he knew the rules to. Over the next few days, the messages multiplied. His mother found one in her purse as she rummaged for her keys. "Secrets don't stay buried." Another appeared inside the refrigerator, taped to a carton of milk. "He knows the truth." Neither parent admitted to the other that they had found them at first, too shaken and too proud to reveal their own fear. Kairos watched them both carefully, noting the way his father lingered in rooms longer than usual, scanning corners as though someone might be there, or how his mother began locking the bedroom door even in the middle of the day. Kairos never said a word. That was the brilliance of it. His silence became his cloak. To his parents, the notes were the work of someone outside, an intruder, a stalker, maybe even a stranger from their tangled past. They never once thought to look at their own son, and so, every time they dismissed him, every time they overlooked his presence, they only confirmed how invisible he was, how perfectly hidden in plain sight. He varied the notes, sometimes short, sometimes longer. One evening, his father discovered a slip of paper inside his briefcase. "Do you tell her everything?" That same night, his mother found a note in the laundry basket. "Does he know what you've done?" The words were vague enough to sting without giving anything away, designed to ignite suspicion between them. And it worked. Arguments became louder, more frequent. His parents accused each other of meddling, of planting the notes themselves to manipulate one another. His father shouted that his mother had too many secrets, and his mother hissed that his father was paranoid because of his own guilt. Kairos sat at the table during these storms, eating quietly, eyes lowered, as though none of it concerned him. But inside, he was measuring every reaction, every escalation, cataloging their unraveling with the precision of a scientist. The strange occurrences weren't just notes. Kairos added layers to his silent campaign. His father's watch would go missing, only to reappear a day later in a drawer he rarely used. His mother's favorite perfume bottle disappeared, only to be placed neatly on her pillow when she returned from errands. Small things, harmless on their own but unsettling when they piled up. The house itself began to feel haunted, not by spirits but by suspicion, by the unseen hand of someone always watching. One night, Kairos staged it further. He slipped into the hallway while his parents slept, tapping lightly against the wall near their room, then retreating quickly back to his bed. His father woke furious, storming through the house with a flashlight, convinced someone had broken in. His mother clutched her robe tightly, eyes darting into every shadow. Kairos lay still beneath his blanket, feigning sleep when his father checked his room. The next morning his parents hardly spoke to each other, both on edge, both tired from the restless night. And Kairos? He watched them, his silence betraying nothing while satisfaction simmered deep inside. The more the messages appeared, the more his parents turned against each other. They whispered about threats from the past, about enemies they might have made, never realizing the true enemy was under their own roof. Kairos didn't even need to invent elaborate lies. Their own guilt filled in the blanks. They projected their secrets onto the anonymous words, making his job effortless. He didn't need to tell them what they had done. They already knew, and the fear of exposure was enough to fracture them further. By the end of the month, his parents were no longer just suspicious. They were terrified. His mother jumped at every phone call, demanding to know who was on the line. His father double-checked the locks each night, sometimes getting up again just to make sure. Their once cold but controlled household had descended into paranoia, and Kairos had orchestrated it all, without ever speaking a single word. What thrilled him most wasn't the fear itself, but the power. For years he had felt powerless, silenced by parents who dismissed him, bullied by peers who mocked him. But now, every note he wrote, every object he moved, every whisper of uncertainty he left behind was proof that he controlled the narrative. His parents thought themselves clever, dominant, in charge. But the truth was simple. They danced to strings they couldn't even see, and Kairos was the one pulling them. And still, he wasn't finished. These messages were only the beginning. They were the foundation of something greater, a slow erosion of his parents' control. The real revenge was not in scaring them with words, but in watching them destroy themselves piece by piece, suspicion by suspicion, until the family they had built on lies crumbled under its own weight. The tension in the house had become unbearable. What once was a home filled with cold silence and occasional arguments had now turned into a battlefield, where every shadow seemed threatening, every misplaced object a sign of intrusion. Kairos's plan was working exactly as he intended, though his parents would never suspect the hand behind it. They had begun to whisper late into the night, voices low but sharp, as though the walls themselves might betray them. One evening, Kairos lingered in the hallway, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor, listening through the thin wall as his parents argued in hushed tones. "It's him," his father growled. "Someone from work. I knew it would come back to haunt me." His mother snapped back, her voice trembling not with anger but with fear. "Don't be ridiculous. It's not about you, it's about me. Someone knows what I did. Someone's playing games with us." Kairos bit back a smile in the darkness. Their paranoia was feeding on itself, each note and misplaced item confirming their deepest insecurities. They had built their lives on lies, and now those lies were turning into specters chasing them down. What pleased Kairos most was how easily they believed the threat came from outside. They never once looked at him, never even considered that their own son might be the mastermind. The following week, his father began making phone calls behind closed doors, his voice low and urgent, speaking of debts and old colleagues. He even installed a new lock on the front door, boasting that no stranger could get in now. His mother, meanwhile, became jumpy, insisting on closing the curtains even during the day, muttering about someone watching from across the street. She started taking longer routes home from the market, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be following her. Kairos observed it all with the same quiet patience, his eyes calm while his mind catalogued every new habit. The more they suspected outsiders, the more blind they became to the truth. One night, his father paced the living room, muttering about hiring a private investigator. Kairos sat quietly at the dining table, pencil moving across his homework, while inside he marveled at the irony. They were willing to spend money, to seek strangers for answers, all while the real threat was sitting a few feet away, unseen in his silence. The arguments between his parents escalated further. His father accused his mother of keeping secrets that attracted danger. His mother accused his father of arrogance that made enemies. Their distrust deepened, each note Kairos planted widening the crack between them. They began locking personal items away, suspecting that each other might be planting the messages, even accusing one another of orchestrating the strange occurrences. Their words grew venomous, and sometimes they stopped speaking altogether, communicating only through slamming doors and pointed glares. One night, when his mother discovered a note inside her jewelry box, truth always finds its way, she stormed into the kitchen and flung the paper at his father's chest. "This is your doing, isn't it?" she shouted, her eyes blazing. His father read the words, his face tightening. "You think I have time for childish games? This is someone else, someone who knows too much about us." Kairos, watching from the staircase, kept his face blank, his presence unnoticed. The scene played out like theater, every accusation exactly as he had hoped. His parents were trapped in a spiral of distrust, their world shrinking until even their marriage felt like enemy territory. But the fear didn't stop inside the house. His father began leaving later for work, as though he were trying to avoid someone waiting for him. His mother started checking their mail with shaking hands, scanning envelopes for hidden threats. They both began to believe they were being followed, glancing nervously at strangers on the street. Kairos only had to nudge them with his carefully planted notes. "You can't hide forever. We know what you did," to keep the paranoia alive. The beauty of it was how their own imaginations did the rest of the work. He didn't need to explain the messages. Their guilt filled in the blanks. Every vague phrase became a mirror reflecting their sins back at them. And the more they feared outsiders, the safer Kairos became in his disguise. He was the invisible son, the quiet boy too harmless to suspect, the perfect mask behind which a mastermind could operate undetected. One evening, Kairos's father came home furious, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. "I saw someone watching the house," he declared, pacing the living room like a caged animal, standing across the street, tall man, black coat. "I know he was there for us." His mother went pale, clutching her necklace. "What if they've been watching all along?" she whispered. Kairos lowered his gaze, hiding the satisfaction that burned in his chest. There had been no man in a coat, no shadowed figure across the street. His father's own fear had conjured it, proving how far gone they already were. The house was no longer a place of order and control. It was a prison of their own making, every sound a threat, every glance a suspicion. And still through it all, Kairos remained the same quiet presence, overlooked, underestimated, invisible. His silence was the perfect cover, his patience the sharpest weapon. His parents, once so sure of their dominance, were unraveling thread by thread, destroying themselves while the true mastermind sat calmly in their midst, waiting for the moment when observation would no longer be enough, when the final strike would shatter their fragile illusions completely. The house no longer felt like a home. It was a cage rattling with suspicion and fear. Kairos walked through it silently, his steps deliberate, his expression calm. Every corner carried the residue of the chaos he had orchestrated. His father jumped at shadows, his mother whispered to herself when she thought no one was listening, and neither of them looked at each other with anything resembling trust anymore. Their walls had cracked, their lies had bled into the open, and Kairos had been the silent hand pulling every string. But now, he knew the time for shadows was ending. The final act was near, and the sun they ignored would finally become the force they could not escape. Kairos had spent nights refining his plan, mapping it out in the secret notebook hidden beneath his mattress. Every page was filled with calculations, observations, and strategies, but the last pages contained something different. These weren't just notes of their flaws or records of their mistakes. These were blueprints of his vengeance. It wasn't enough to watch them crumble from the inside. No, the final move needed to be undeniable, unforgettable, and irreversible. They needed to see him, truly see him, and understand what they had created. The opportunity came on a stormy evening, when rain battered the windows and the house groaned under the weight of the wind. His parents were already on edge, their voices raised in yet another argument about who might be behind the strange occurrences that had plagued them for weeks. His father swore it was someone from his past, an old rival come back to torment him. His mother hissed that it was someone from her own mistakes, a figure she had buried long ago. They shouted over each other until their voices broke, neither willing to admit the truth, that their son sat at the center of it all, watching them unravel. Kairos waited until the storm peaked, the thunder loud enough to mask his movements. He slipped into his father's study, where the drawer of photographs and letters still lay hidden. He had studied them so many times that the images were etched into his mind, but tonight he took them all, spreading them across the dining table where his parents would see. He placed the notes he had written among them, carefully chosen phrases like, "Lies never stay buried and the past always returns." The table became a battlefield of truth, every betrayal laid bare under the harsh light of the chandelier. When his parents finally walked into the room, their argument stopped cold. His mother's hand flew to her mouth, his father's eyes widened with fury and fear. For a long moment, neither of them moved, staring at the evidence of their own hypocrisy scattered like broken glass across the table. "Where did these come from?" his father demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Kairos stepped out of the shadows, his face calm, his eyes steady. He didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel the weight of his presence. His mother trembled, whispering his name as though she were seeing him for the first time. "It was you," his father said finally, realization dawning. "All this time. It was you." Kairos tilted his head slightly, not with guilt, but with quiet triumph. His silence had always been mistaken for weakness, but now it was the sharpest answer he could give. He let them sit with their shock, their betrayal turned inward, their guilt flooding the room. For once they couldn't ignore him. For once, he was the center, the one who controlled the narrative. The storm outside raged louder, thunder cracking like applause. His parents began to demand explanations, their voices rising in desperation, but Kairos remained composed. He didn't need to scream. He didn't need to defend himself. Every note, every staged occurrence, every piece of evidence on that table was his voice louder than any words he could have spoken. And then came the moment where vengeance collided with something deeper, love, or at least the remnants of it. For as much as Kairos despised them, as much as he had built his identity on their neglect and betrayal, a part of him had always longed for recognition, for them to see him not as a burden or a shadow, but as their son. This final act wasn't just revenge, it was a demand to be acknowledged, to be remembered, to be impossible to ignore. His parents' faces twisted between fear, anger, and something else. Guilt. They saw him not just as the mastermind, who had brought them to their knees, but as the child they had failed, the boy they had overlooked until it was too late. And in that moment, Kairos finally felt the shift he had been waiting for. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't silent. He was the force that had shattered their illusions, and they would never forget it. The storm carried on into the night, but inside the house a different kind of silence settled. Not the silence of neglect, not the silence of a boy ignored, but the silence after a truth too heavy to deny. Kairos stood in the center of it, the youngest mastermind, the son who had turned his pain into power, watching as his parents sat before the ruins of their lies, finally understanding who he had become.